Hello, it's Mrs. Jones here, and this, of course, is Fred.
Hello.
Okay, we've come together today to tell you a story, but this isn't like any normal story. No, Mrs. Jones isn't going to be using any books. You won't see any pictures. You'll just see Mrs. Jones and Fred. You'll have to listen to the words, and you'll have to use your imagination to work out what's going on in the story and see if you can see those pictures in your head. Right, are we ready to begin, Fred?
Yeah.
Once upon a time, me and Fred, we went for a little walk, not far from where Mrs. Jones lives, in some nice quiet woodland. And Fred, very cleverly, well, you spotted something, didn't you, Fred?
I did.
Well, what did you spot?
I spotted a toadstool ring.
That's right, there was toadstools, and they were growing in a perfect circle. Now, these toadstool rings, if you're lucky enough to see them, they're very, very magic indeed. And toadstool rings, Fred,
Yeah.
are made by the woodland fairies, who are indeed the most magical of creatures. Now then.
Well, Mrs. Jones,
Yes, Fred.
how do you know this?
Well, Fred, I read a lot of things in books. That's why reading's so fantastic, and that's how I learnt about the fairies and their fairy rings. I read it in a book. Now then, would you like to know what else I know about fairy rings?
Yeah.
Well, fairy rings are very magical, like I said, and I'd like to explore them further.
I want to step in one.
No, Fred. You can't just step in a fairy ring. Fairy rings, as I say, have very powerful magic, but you have to know how to use them.
Well, what do you do then?
Well, if you're with somebody, you have to hold their hand, and you both have to jump together at the same time and land inside the fairy ring.
Not sure I want to.
But Fred, I'd like you to be brave, because I don't want to go on my own.
Okay.
Right, let's hold hands then, Fred. All right, we're going to close our eyes and we're going to count to 3 and then we're going to jump, okay?
Uh-huh.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Whew. And we landed right in the middle of the fairy ring. Now then, we had a blinding light that dazzled in front of our eyes, and a funny little whizzing noise that was completely buzzing around in our ears. It was a little bit scary, but then all of a sudden the noise stopped and we were able to open our eyes very slowly, Fred. Just give them a couple of blinks, just to get our eyes accustomed to the light.
Wow.
And as we blinked our eyes, we looked around and we found ourselves in the most beautiful woodland area, and we were surrounded by the most fantastic ancient oak trees, and they stretched as far out as the eye could see.
Wow.
Now, as we stood and looked a little bit closer, Fred noticed something.
Mrs. Jones,
Yes, Fred.
I've seen something.
What did you see?
Some of the trees, Mrs. Jones, have got doors in their trunks.
Wow, doors in their trunks. And as I looked a bit closer, Fred was right. And on the tree that was close to me and Fred, we saw the most beautiful, exquisite door. It was painted in a bright yellow paint, just like a canary. And it had the most lovely brass fittings, and it had a little door knocker that was just shaped like an oak leaf.
I want to knock on the door.
Well, let's hold on a minute. And as we walked a little bit closer, we looked down and noticed the floor was covered in the most beautiful emerald green moss. and it was just like walking on the most expensive carpet. Anyway, as we walked a little bit closer, there was a strange whooshing noise. Listen carefully, Fred.
Okay.
I think the trees are talking to each other.
What?
Yes, listen. Whisher, 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 whisher. Wow, they really are.
How do you know? Oh, don't tell me. You read it in a book.
I did. I read it in a book, and I found out that only oak trees, the only trees that can talk to each other. Right, now then, we're now at that yellow door.
Can I knock on it?
Let's just wait a minute. There was a little plaque next to the door, and it said, let me look closer. Lem Bryan. Oh, what does it say? Lem Bryan Ochre. Gosh, do you think that's a name, Fred?
Could be.
Could be. Do you think he might help us? 'Cause I think we're a little bit lost, and I don't even know how far we are away from home. So Fred decided to knock on the door. There we go. Now the door opened just a small way, and two big orange eyes looked back at us.
Uh-oh.
Wow. Mrs. Jones thought the best thing to do was introduce yourself really quickly with a nice big smile. Hello, I'm Mrs. Jones, and this is my friend, Phonics Fred, and he bowed just like that. The door then opened fully to see we saw the most strangest creature looking back at us. He probably was just a little bit taller than Mrs. Jones' waist. So obviously a bit taller than Fred, but quite a bit smaller than Mrs. Jones. He wore a nice knitted, warm, fluffy jumper and some brown trousers, and both of them were smudged with mud.
Oh.
And Fred noticed he wasn't wearing any shoes.
No.
And he had the strangest of feet. They were quite large for his body, and in between his toes the skin was webbed, and at the end he didn't have toenails. He had big thick black claws, a bit like dog claws really. Now his face was something else. He had those big orange eyes, remember, but he had the most beautiful smile, the largest grin that spread near enough from ear to ear. So we kind of had a clue he was going to be friendly. And his hair, wow, that was all straggly and kind of hanging down, and it was a little bit like the same colour as the moss in the tree that we'd seen on the floor underneath the trees. And on his hair there was like tiny drops of dew which sparkled just like diamonds. Anyway, he looked at us and we looked back at him, and he introduced himself. Hello, he said. My name is, let me just check again because it's quite an unusual name. Lem Bryan Ochre, and I am a boggis, he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mrs. Jones says, hello, I'm Mrs. Jones. He said, whoa, I know that, you've said. But what are you? Oh, I said, I'm a human. Oh, he said, don't get many humans around here. Anyway, I explained to him that me and Fred were a little bit lost, and that we needed some help to try and find our way back home. Anyway, because he was a kind old fellow, he invited us in. So we went through the little door, and as we peeped in, there were some steps winding down. And as we climbed those steps, we had to kind of squeeze past the roots of the oak tree. Now, Mrs. Jones was a little bit of a tight squeeze, but I managed. But Fred,
Oh, it's easy for me.
it was easy for him. And we went down the nice stone steps, and we came out into a beautiful little room that it looked like the boggis had dug out. So his strange appearance seemed to make a lot more sense now. So it was quite dark in the room, but over in the far part of the room there was a nice cosy log fire burning. It was crackled, it was lovely. And then on opposite sides of the wall there was 2 candles that sat on tiny little wooden shelves, and they flickered beautifully. The room was pretty basic. He just had a little wooden table and chairs, a nice comfy armchair next to the fire, and he invited us in. Me and Fred sat down, and he wanted to know how we came about in his world, in his land, really. Anyway, I explained to Len Bryan that we had found a toadstool ring that was made by the woodland fairies, and we jumped in. Now, Lemon Bran was a little bit cross and a little bit put out. "Huh," he said, "those meddling fairies." He was none too pleased that we'd arrived in his very secret and precious place. Now, these woodlands were so precious to him that he promised us that we must keep it a secret.
We did, didn't we?
We did. We said we'd honour that promise. Anyway, because he was such a lovely old fellow, he made us a nice steaming hot cup of tea, which he made by a kettle that was hanging on a metal hook above the flames of the fire. And he also made us some hot buttered toast, which he put the bread on the end of a toasting fork, and again he toasted it on the fire. It was delicious. Anyway, we said to Len Bryan that we wanted to go back home, and could he help us find another fairy ring. Anyway, Len Bryan explained to us that you can't get back the same way as you arrived.
Oh no.
And me and Fred, well, we just looked at each other in dismay. How are we going to get home, Fred? Anyway, luckily for us, Len Bryan was a very, very important person in the Boggis community. Now, the bit that I forgot to tell you, which I did notice right at the beginning, that he wore something rather grand on his head. It looked a little bit like a crown, and it was made out of hazel. It was woven together, almost looked like it was alive. And I wondered back then if he was something special or a person of great importance, and it turns out he was, and he was the most wisest and knowledgeable of all the Boggis. And he said he thinks he knows a way to get us back home. So after we'd finished our hot cup of tea and eaten up all our toast, and we thanked him kindly from the bottom of our hearts, he took us back out into that beautiful ancient woodland, and we walked together on that lovely moss. He went and led us to the most ancient and wisest of all the oak trees. It was the most magnificent tree I have ever seen, and the largest.
I was amazed too.
Yes, you were, Fred. Now, he explained that we had to climb into the lower boughs of the tree, which was easy enough. They were quite low, and I helped you, didn't I, Fred?
You did.
And we sat together on one of the low boughs of the tree. Now then, this is when Len Bryan came into his own. He whispered a very, very enchanting spell. It was in a language me and Fred have never heard before. And when he was doing his saying his enchantment, the trees were also joining in and whispering to each other, "Wisher, wisher, wisher, wisher." And I held on to Fred's hand like this, and we closed our eyes like this. And again, just like before, there was a blinding light and a very loud buzzing in our ears. And the next thing we knew, the noise had stopped, and we very carefully opened our eyes and we blinked in the light. And as we looked round, we noticed we were back in the place where we started in our walk, not far from Mrs. Jones's house. And we recognised we were in the exact same wood
We did.
where we went for our little walk. "Now, Fred," I said, "what an adventure."
It was amazing.
It was amazing. We was just a little bit sad because we didn't know whether we'd see Len Brian ever again.
We'll have to look for a fairy ring.
We will have to look for a fairy ring, because I'd love to see him again. I'd love to sit next to that fire, eating hot buttered toast and drinking warm tea. Right, that's the end of my adventure. So if you're ever out walking in the woods in the holidays, keep looking, because you never know. You might be lucky enough to see a toadstool ring. And if you do, remember what I said and take care. And hopefully, if you go to the same place I did, you might be lucky enough to look out for that little yellow door and say hello to Len Brian Ochre from me and Fred. And I'm sure he'll make you feel very welcome. Okay, bye-bye. See you again soon.
Bye.